If a French person from Paris walked into a bar in Quebec City and struck up a conversation, there's a real chance they wouldn't understand half of what was being said. Not because of an accent, because Canadian French, in some ways, is basically its own language wearing French's clothes. Words like char instead of voiture, blonde for girlfriend. A whole verb tense the French dropped centuries ago, still alive and well in Quebec. So how did one language split into two so different they sometimes need subtitles for each other? Let's get into it. Let's clear something up right away. When people say Canadian French, they make it sound like one single way of speaking. That's not true. Canadian French is not one thing. It's actually a whole family of different ways of speaking French, and they don't all sound the same. Think of it like a big family with several cousins. They all come from the same roots, but each one grew up a little differently. The biggest member of this family is called Québécois French. This is the French spoken in the province of Quebec by about 7 million people. When most people picture Canadian French in their heads, this is usually what they mean. It's the version you'll hear in Montreal, in Quebec City, and across most of that province. Next, we have Acadian French. This one is spoken in New Brunswick and in parts of Nova Scotia. It sounds different from Québécois French. In some ways, it actually sounds older. Some experts say Acadian French is closer to the French that was spoken long ago in Western France, back before things changed so much. Then there's something called Chiac. This one is really unique. It's spoken in the southeastern part of New Brunswick, and it's a true mix. Speakers blend French grammar with English words, sometimes in the very same sentence. If you didn't grow up around it, it can sound like a brand new language on its own. And finally, there are smaller French-speaking communities too, like the Franco-Ontarians in Ontario and the Franco-Manitobans in Manitoba. These groups are smaller in number, but they still have their own way of speaking, shaped by where they live and who they live around. So why does this matter? Because when we talk about Canadian French in this video, we need to be honest. There is no one single accent or one single way of speaking. It's more like a spectrum, a wide range of sounds and words, all connected, but all a little bit different. For the rest of this video, we're going to mainly focus on Québécois French. That's simply because it's the biggest group, and it's what most people picture when they hear the words Canadian French. But please remember this as we go along. Canadian French is not one voice. It's many voices, all part of the same big family. So, how did French in Canada end up sounding so different from French in France? To answer that, we need to go back in time, all the way to the 1600s. Back then, settlers from France began arriving in what we now call Quebec. But here's something important to understand. The French they brought with them was not the neat, standard French we think of today. That standard version didn't really exist yet. Instead, these settlers spoke French the way people spoke it in their own home regions across France. So already, from the very start, it was a mix of different accents and styles, not one single perfect version. Now let's jump ahead to the year 1763. This is a big turning point. After a war called the 7 Years' War, France gave up its land in North America to Britain. From that moment on, something important happened. French Canadians were mostly cut off from France. Think about what that really means. No shared newspapers. No shared radio, since radio didn't exist yet, but you get the idea. No shared government. Very little contact between the two groups for over 100 years. Meanwhile, back in France, life went on, and the language kept changing. This became especially true after the French Revolution. During that time, leaders in Paris pushed hard to create one standard way of speaking French across the whole country. They wanted to get rid of regional differences and make everyone sound the same. So now picture this. You have two groups of people. They started out speaking the same language, but one group kept changing and modernizing back home in France. The other group, over in Canada, was cut off, isolated, left to grow on its own for generation after generation. And here's the fascinating part. Quebec French actually held on to a lot of older pronunciations and older expressions. the very ones that France itself eventually dropped and moved away from. In a way, Québécois French became like a time capsule. It kept alive pieces of French from the 1600s, while also growing its own new words and expressions along the way, shaped by life in Canada. So when someone from France hears certain old-fashioned sounding words in Quebec, it's not that Quebec is behind or wrong, it's actually the opposite in some cases. Quebec kept the old ways, while France moved forward and changed. Now, let's talk about the part most people notice first. The sound. Even before you understand a single word, you can often tell right away if someone is speaking French from France or French from Quebec. The accent is just that different. Let's look at a few reasons why. First, there's something called nasal vowels. Don't worry, this is simpler than it sounds. In French, some sounds come out through the nose a little bit, like the in sound or the un sound. In France, these sounds are made one way, but in Quebec, they're made a bit further forward in the mouth, and they sound more nasal, more through the nose. It's a small difference, but to someone used to hearing French from France, it stands out right away. Second, there's something called diphthongization. That's a big word, but here's what it really means. In Paris, many vowel sounds are short and flat, but in Quebec, those same vowels often get stretched out into two sounds instead of one. Take the word fête, which means party or celebration. In France, it sounds simply like fête, but in Quebec, it can stretch out and sound closer to fête, almost like two vowel sounds blending together. It's a small stretch, but it changes the whole feel of the word. Third, and this might be the biggest giveaway of all, is what happens to the letters T and D. In Quebec, when a T or a D comes before certain vowels, something interesting happens. The T can start to sound like T, and the D can start to sound like D's. So a simple word like to, meaning you, can come out sounding like T, and the word dire, meaning to say, can come out sounding like desire. This one small change is often the very first thing that tips off a listener. If you've only ever studied French in a classroom, using the France style of speaking, this sound can throw you off completely at first. Many students who learn standard French and then travel to Quebec are surprised, even a little confused, when they hear this. Their ears simply are not trained for it yet. So, when you put all these small pieces together, the nasal sounds, the stretched out vowels, and that special T's and DZ touch on the T's and D's, you get an accent that is proudly, unmistakably, Québécois. It's not better or worse than the French spoken in Paris. It's simply its own sound, shaped by centuries of history, distance, and everyday life in Canada. Now we get to the fun part, the words themselves. This is where Canadian French really starts to feel like its own thing, because so many everyday words in Quebec would sound old-fashioned, or country-style, or just plain strange to someone visiting from France. Let's look at a few great examples. Start with the word for car. In France, people say voiture, but in Quebec, people often say char instead. To French ears, this word sounds almost like something out of the past, since char used to mean chariot, like something you'd see in an old painting, not a modern car. Next, think about the word weekend. In France, they simply borrowed the English word and made it their own, saying le weekend. But Quebec takes a different approach. Quebec works hard to protect its French language from English influence, so instead of weekend, they say la fin de semaine, which simply means the end of the week. Now here's a fun one. In Quebec, if you want to talk about your girlfriend or boyfriend, you might hear the words blonde and chum. And here's the surprising part. These words have nothing to do with hair color. Blonde simply means girlfriend, and chum simply means boyfriend, no matter what they actually look like. There's also a wonderful little phrase in Quebec, être tanné. This means to be annoyed, or fed up, or tired of something. France doesn't really have one single phrase that captures this feeling in quite the same simple way. And here's one that trips a lot of people up. The names for meals. In France, breakfast is petit déjeuner, lunch is déjeuner, And dinner is dîner. But in Quebec, breakfast is déjeuner, lunch is dîner, and dinner is souper. So the exact same words mean two different meals, depending on which country you're in. Imagine ordering dinner and showing up at lunchtime instead. Now here's something bigger, and honestly, a little surprising. Quebec actually has a government office called the Office Québécois de la Langue Française. Their job, in part, is to create new French words to replace English tech words and pop culture terms, so English doesn't slowly creep into everyday French. Meanwhile, in France, people are much more relaxed about borrowing English words. They freely use words like le weekend, le parking, and le shopping without a second thought. And that brings us to something a little ironic. The version of French that often sounds more foreign or strange to people in Paris is actually the version working the hardest to protect and preserve pure French. Quebec isn't drifting away from French. In many ways, it's fighting to hold on to it. Now let's talk about grammar. I know, that word can sound boring, but stay with me, because this part is actually pretty fascinating. It turns out, Quebec French held on to some old grammar habits that France quietly dropped along the way. Think of them as little ghosts from the past, still walking around in everyday Quebec speech. Let's start with the word ne. In proper textbook French, to say no or to make something negative, you use two words together. For example, I don't know is je ne sais pas. Notice that little word ne sitting right in the middle. Well, in casual speech, both in France and in Quebec, that little ne often gets dropped. But in Quebec, it happens even more often, even more naturally. So instead of je ne sais pas, people simply say je sais pas. Short, quick, and very common in daily conversation. Next, here's something that can genuinely confuse someone from France. In Quebec, people often add a small word to into questions, just to mark that it's a question. For example, instead of asking, as tu fini, which means, have you finished? Someone in Quebec might say, tas tu fini? That little extra tu isn't adding any real meaning. It's simply a spoken habit, a way of forming questions out loud. This pattern barely exists in France at all, and it can sound completely unfamiliar to European French speakers the first time they hear it. And finally, there are some older verb forms and pronunciations, ones that were common in France back in the 1600s, that are still alive today in rural parts of Quebec. These are pieces of French that mainland France left behind centuries ago, but Quebec, especially in smaller, more isolated communities, simply kept using them, generation after generation. Linguists, the experts who study language, have a great way of describing this. They compare it to animals living on an isolated island. When a group gets cut off from the rest of the world, it often keeps certain traits that the mainland population eventually loses or changes. Nobody sends the island population a memo saying, hey, we've updated things over here. So the old traits just continue on, untouched, generation after generation. That's basically what happened with Quebec French. Cut off from France for so long, it simply held on to certain grammar patterns and sounds, while France kept moving forward and changing. So when you hear these little grammar quirks in Quebec French today, you're not hearing mistakes. You're actually hearing living pieces of history, echoes of a French that used to exist everywhere, but now survives mainly in Quebec. After everything we've talked about, the accent, the words, the grammar, you might be wondering, can French people and Quebec people even understand each other at all? That's a fair question. Let's break it down. The honest answer is mostly yes, especially when it comes to formal French or written French. Think of things like the news, books, official documents, or school lessons. This kind of French tends to stay fairly standard across the whole French-speaking world. That's because it's shaped by shared media, shared education, and shared literature. So if you pick up a newspaper in France, and then pick one up in Quebec, you'll be able to read both without too much trouble. But here's where it gets tricky. Once you move away from formal French and into casual, everyday, fast-paced conversation, things can get genuinely difficult. This becomes very clear when you look at something called joual. Joual is the informal, working-class way of speaking French in Montreal. It's full of slang, quick pronunciation, and casual grammar. In fact, there are videos online of French YouTubers and journalists visiting Quebec and openly admitting, on camera, that they're struggling to follow along when locals speak quickly in joual. It's not that they don't know French. It's that this particular style of speaking is simply unfamiliar to them. And this goes both ways. When people from Quebec travel to France, they sometimes get comments too. French locals might say their expressions sound old-fashioned or even rural, almost like something from the countryside, from an earlier time. But here's the twist we've already talked about. In many cases, it's actually France that changed over the years, while Quebec kept the older forms of speaking. So calling it old-fashioned isn't really fair. It's simply older French, preserved. So how should we really think about this relationship? It's probably best not to imagine it as two completely different languages. It's more helpful to picture it like two cousins. Imagine two cousins who grew up on opposite sides of the world. They share the same grandparents, the same family roots, maybe even the same holidays and traditions. But because they grew up so far apart, they ended up with completely different slang, different pop culture references, and different inside jokes that only make sense within their own group. That's really what's happening between France and Quebec. Same language family, same deep roots, but two very different everyday experiences, shaped by hundreds of years of separate history. So yes, they can understand each other, most of the time. But every now and then, in fast, casual conversation, it takes a little extra effort, a little patience, just like it would between any two cousins catching up after years apart. Honestly, this is just one chapter in a much bigger story. French is spoken across dozens of countries: West Africa, the Caribbean, Switzerland, Belgium, and every single one has its own accent, slang, and grammatical quirks shaped by its own history. Canadian French isn't a broken or lesser version of French. It's a living branch of the language that took its own path for 400 years. If you found this interesting, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into how languages split, evolve, and surprise us.